Money.
Or money. Let me find out something about the audience. I want to see a show of hands of how many have had at least one course in macroeconomics at the college level. Okay. So those people will see quite a huge contrast between what you learned there, unless you learned it at George Mason University maybe, and what you learn here. And for those who didn't raise your hands, good. Your minds aren't corrupted. You're ready to see what macroeconomics should look like. And I call this capital-based macro, which is a term that's sort of caught on, I'm happy to say. It makes me feel good that people call it capital-based macro, and it's not that, if you prefer, okay, it's Austrian macro, okay? But I avoided that, at least in my classes at Auburn, just to fend off statements about what is this Australian economics? No, it's Austrian, and then the judgment that it applies only in Austria. No, that's just where it came from. Okay, capital-based also gives me a very sharp contrast between money-based macro, which is Friedman, and labor-based macro, which is Keynes. So you get a three-way distinction there that pays off. Steve Horowitz helped me out earlier by suggesting that capital theory was sort of the sine qua non of Austrian macro, and so that's true too. What you'll see in this slide presentation, you might think of as a tinker-toy approach to macro. And I had the benefit, though, of having both Israel Kirzner and Steve Horowitz lecture before me. And I'm certainly not trying to give an alternative to what they're saying. In fact, essential for my tinker toys to work out at all is that there be some Kirznerian entrepreneurs on duty, and that economic calculation using market prices is the order of the day. Okay, so my little graphics sort of presuppose the validity of Horowitz and Kirzner's talks. I'll start out with just a brief overview so you can see where we're going. And one of my objectives here is to make capital-based macro intelligible to mainstream economists. I'm trying to reach out to the mainstream. And I use a number of analytical devices that should be familiar to even mainstream economists, like something as simple as the production possibilities frontier, the loanable funds market, supply and demand for loans, which determines the interest rate. The uniquely Austrian part is the structure of production, much about that a little later, the Hayekian triangles and all that. And then stage-specific labor markets we'll see in this show, or at least in the one I give the follow-on show on Friday, that one of the ways to do battle with Keynes is show that it makes a difference whether you're talking about late stage or early stage when you say what's going on in labor markets, whereas Keynes just look at the labor market, okay? Then applications for capital-based macro is worth looking at for a moment. Most of my talk actually is going to be on the first application, sustainable growth. And I'm not going to save my punchline to the end. That is supported by saving. That's what makes it sustainable, by the way. And then we can get a contrast with unsustainable growth, which is triggered by credit creation. And here what's worth pointing out is a huge difference between the Austrians and the mainstream. The mainstream economists, since Keynes, in fact this was one of Keynes's main contributions, if you want to call it that, is that he separated the subject matters. That macro per se, which is dealing with cyclical variation and lapses from full employment, is one field, and another field is growth theory, which involves the growth of the economy and increasing capital stock, increasing capacity, and so on. And those are two different fields of study. And if you treat them as two different fields of study, then you simply miss this critical distinction between growth that's sustainable, that's just plain old growth, and growth that's unsustainable, that's boom and bust. Okay, so by melding the two, or actually I'm being anachronistic here, before Keynes the two were together, but by blending the two you get to see the difference between them. Okay, just a brief mention, this audience doesn't need much more than that the Austrian theory has its roots in the early book by Mises, 1912, Theory of Money and Credit, in which she set out the theory in just a few pages near the end of the book. It was picked up on by Hayek in the late 20s and early 30s. It was prices and production was ground zero for his exposition of the Austrian theory. It occurred to me when I listened to Steve Horowitz talk that the whole issue of economic calculation and the socialist calculation debate occurred after this. This came before. And for Mises, the key article is 1920 and then 1922 for the work on socialism. For Hayek, it was late 30s before he turned to the issue of the role of prices in the market economy. And before that, though, they set out the business cycle theory that nonetheless presumed the calculational aspects of the economy that they only set out later. Okay. Now, a methodological point, which is worth noting, made by Hayek, and just in stating it, it seems right. Before we can even ask how things might go wrong, we must first explain how they could ever go right. I paraphrased that from one of Hayek's articles, and I actually took that picture at the University of Hartford when we had a conference there years ago. And this is a maxim that's observed in the breach by most macroeconomists. Keynes, for instance, never imagined that things could go right. So he just set out to explain particularly how they go wrong. And Friedman, by implication, with his monetary theory, assumes that markets work and there's no reason to even raise this issue of how things could go right in his macro framework, and just showed how they could go wrong with the Federal Reserve in play. It also shows why I'll spend so much time with sustainable growth, because what you should see, or what I hope you will see, is that when we set out the principles of sustainable growth, in other words, showing how the market could work right if allowed to, then the business cycle theory is almost a mere corollary, okay? That if we know how it goes right, then we can see how it would go wrong if, for instance, prices were telling the same story, if the interest rate were telling the wrong story, that by having too low an interest rate and so on. So we'll see how that works. I'm going to start with the production possibilities frontier, which is in virtually every textbook in the opening chapters. And it shows the alternative uses of resources, with consumption on one axis, vertical axis, and investment on the other. Right away, we're at odds with Keynes, because if you have taken macro, you learn that both investment and consumption are on the vertical axis. They're just added together as two kinds of spending to be juxtaposed with total earning. Earning and spending is a circular flow kind of a conception. Here we're showing them as alternative trade-offs, or alternative ways of using resources. And then assuming markets are working, like Kersner says, and so on, you get a fully employed market economy, and it allocates the resources in accordance with people's preferences somewhere on that frontier. And the frontier itself represents, in the macroeconomic sense, full employment. Okay, and textbooks will even recognize this. So they'll show you the frontier, they'll show you where full employment is. If you're inside the frontier, of course, you have a recession. There's some scope, not much, there's some scope for pushing beyond the frontier, but it's not sustainable. I mean, the curve is defined in terms of sustainable levels of consumption and investment, which implies that you can have some unsustainable levels just beyond the frontier. They just won't last, it's temporary. And that's the common term is an overheated economy, or it's a boom, okay, artificial boom. So we'll allow for some movement beyond the frontier, but not so much. And here I'm just recognizing that in the textbooks, you see this PPF in demonstrating the policies of different countries, or showing how they're something about capital and interest or international trade and so on. But it rarely appears, and in fact never appears that I know of, in a macroeconomic construction. It sort of drops out of sight after the introductory material. Well, I want to bring it back in and integrate it with other things we know about the economy. Let's see, I think I skipped something here. Let me go back. Okay. Here what I'm showing is that this level of investment is largely, or at least a large part of it, is this replacement capital that each period you have to have so much investment just to offset machines wearing out, obsolescence, and so on. That's called replacement capital. It offsets depreciation. And I've shown that there as replacement capital. Then it turns out the difference between the replacement capital and the gross represents net investment. In other words, that's increasing the productive capacity of the economy. So net investment would be that much. These are just for purposes of illustration. I'm not deriving how much these are. I'm just showing that typically in an economy there is some net investment. Okay. So positive investment means the economy is growing. In other words, next year the frontier itself will be shifted outward by some amount, and then you can have more of both the next year. And if you still have more investment, then more of both the following year, and so on. So that's what represents sustainable growth. Presumably that investment is being financed, as we'll see later, by saving, by people producing output, getting paid for it. It's called income, not spending it all, and saving a certain amount, which frees up some of what they produce for use in expanding the capacity of the economy. Okay? So here I say, watch the economy grow. You can hear the economy grow. Okay, there it grows. there it is. Okay, so there I show about 4 years of growth, and after 4 periods there, consumption as well as saving and investment increase each period. Okay.
Now that's
the actual rate of growth depends on a lot of things. I mentioned a few of them. The depreciation increases too. People's preferences may change as they begin earning more income and so on. I'm abstracting from those things. But what's important, I think, to this formulation is that you can have a change in saving preferences. In other words, people can decide to save more now, to save more this year, okay? And they want to save more, so they'll be able to buy more in subsequent years. People save not for fun. It's not fun. They save up for spending in the future on consumption, because they save for the same reason that your parents tell you to save. You'd be better off for it.
Saving can be fun.
In the end. Well, for some people it can be fun, okay? So suppose people become more thrifty, more future-oriented. They reduce the current consumption and save instead. Well, if that happens, watch the movement along the PPF, and you see this is sort of non-spectacular. Of course you can move along the PPF. That's why they call it a PPF. That second P stands for possibilities. It's possible to move along the curve. That's what there it goes, okay? So you get movement along the PPF, right? It works that way. Macro is funny, okay? All right.
I just don't remember all these sounds in my macroeconomics class.
No, you didn't. And so the economy grows. The economy grows now at a faster rate. So now watch the economy grow. It does a better job, see? You get bigger steps because you save to start with, right? And it turns out saving makes the difference. Okay, it's that increased thriftiness. We could even compare with the earlier diagram. And you see how saving makes a difference. And because without the saving, the economy grows at a modest rate. You can watch that. With the saving, it's a two-stepper. First, you decrease consumption, and then are able to grow more rapidly. Okay, that's what savings is all about. And after 4 periods, if you just move across there, you see you're consuming more than you would have consumed had you not saved in the first place. Well, again, this is what we all knew in our bones just from listening to our parents, okay? So we ought to factor this into macro. Now, what I've done is show you what's possible, in other words, production possibilities. And what remains to be done is showing you, well, what is it in the marketplace that gives you this result? How does this work? The key signal, of course, is the interest rate. Austrians, in this sense, like other economists, treat the interest rate, at least at this level, in pretty summary terms. We talk about the interest rate as if there's only one. Well, of course, there are lots of interest rates. It depends on term structure, it depends on risk considerations and expectations of inflation and all that. And I'm putting those things on hold for the time being and just looking at the underlying rate of interest. Gives me a more direct comparison with other kinds of macroeconomics in any case. So there's the rate of interest on the vertical axis, and I plot both saving and investment on the horizontal axis. Saving is the supply of loanable funds, and that's the macroeconomic relevant supply. In other words, we're all income earners and consumers, and some of us even have consumption loans, and others are lending money that becomes consumption loans. So I'm netting that out, and I'm asking how much do all of us collectively make available to the investment community out of our current incomes. That's what saving means in my diagrams and in all of the loanable fund diagrams. Usually isn't spelled out just because people don't use this diagram anymore. Demand reflects the business community's willingness to borrow and undertake investment projects, and of course that's downward sloping. And here too, we don't need to assume that all investment is financed by borrowing, but if a firm is using its own funds, retained earnings, in so doing, it's foregoing interest it could have by just putting that money out in the loan market. So that's the opportunity cost of using your own funds, is that same interest rate. If Marshall is alive and well, then you get market clearing in that market rate of interest, and equality between saving and investment. And here's something that's sort of reassuring, I think. Well, you tell me if it's reassuring. Both the Austrian economists, that's Beaumont, and Keynes recognized that the relevant rate should be a very broadly conceived rate, and that the market that's getting equilibrated is the market for investable resources. All right? How much money or how much resources can be used out of a given year for developing the capacity of the economy. Loanable funds market is typically associated, okay, there's the investable resources down there. It's associated with Dennis Robertson, a British economist and one-time ally of Keynes, at least when he wrote the treatise. He had some critical remarks about that, and so Keynes didn't let him see the manuscript of the general theory. But that's Robertson for what he's worth. Now, one thing that'll be more important in my next lecture than this one, but it's worth mentioning here, is that this graph is the only graph to appear in the general theory. You might think if you pick up the general theory, it'd be full of graphs. It's macro, isn't it? But it's not. It has no graphs in it except one. On page 180, this graph appears. And it appears on the recommendation of Roy Herod, who did read the manuscript before Keynes went to press. And Herod said, gee, Maynard, not a direct quote here, but gee, Maynard, it looks like you're throwing out the loanable funds theory of interest. And Maynard said, well, yes, that's it. Out with it. It's gone. And Herod says, well, your reader's not going to believe you. You better make it clear that that's what you're doing, or the reader will be confused. So Keynes says, okay, I'll make it clear. So he put it in, threw it out. Okay? So this is what we're getting rid of. This is what's standing in our way to understanding Keynesian macro. So it got thrown out. Well, all the more then we're kind of glad to have it put back in the Austrian view. It works that way, okay? That's what that says. He discarded it, okay? The Austrians just don't use graphical analysis much, but if you read what they write, you'll find yourself drawing the loanable funds market in the margin. That's what I do, because they think in terms of the loanable funds market, even if they don't draw it. Okay, so if people become more future-oriented, then they increase their saving, causing the interest rate to fall and encouraging the business community to undertake more investments. In other words, supply and demand works just like it does in any other market. The saving will shift to the right, and it says, watch the saving curve shift rightward. You get an increase in saving, and you get more saving and better terms so that the investment community can borrow. All right. So with the given technology, saving and investment are prerequisite to general sustainable economic growth. That's the whole story here. Now, what we see is that the loanable funds market and the production possibilities frontier just give you two views of the same story. All right, it's the same story, just looked at from two different points of view. The bottom one, the loanable funds market, shows how interest rates bring saving and investment in line with one another. And the production possibilities frontier shows how the trade-off is struck between consumption and investment. Okay? So market adjustments in output prices, wage rates, and other inputs keep the economy functioning on its PPF. So there's an underlying assumption that markets are working, that the economy is getting coordinated by Keynesian entrepreneurs. Okay? So it's just telling you that you're getting two views of the same thing. And so as before, we're going to let people increase their saving. They become more future-oriented. They listen to their parents, okay? And it says, watch the saving-induced decrease in the interest rate and the corresponding movement along the PPF. Now what you'll have to do is sort of turn your head sideways so with one eye you can watch the top diagram you see, and the other eye you watch the bottom diagram. But you know what you're going to anticipate. You've seen it both separately. Here it goes. There it is. So you can see it's two views of the same story. You move along the frontier, decreasing consumption and increasing investment. Now, while this seems almost commonsensical and sort of squares with what you know generally about saving and investment and growth, that this contradicts the Keynesian view. The Keynesian view precludes any such working of the market economy, precisely because investment and consumption have moved in opposite directions. Reduce consumption and increase investment. That can't happen in the Keynesian system. Those things move together. Okay. So you get more investment but less consumption. And Keynes said that won't happen. They said Keynes says if people cut down on consumption, inventories will pile up, business is bad, and investors won't invest more. If anything, they'll invest less because they're worried about future profit prospects and so on. In fact, this is precisely what he called his paradox of thrift. Paradoxically, if you try to save by cutting down on consumption, then you'll throw the economy in the dumper. The economy will move inside the PPF and not along the PPF. I'll take questions. I'll take questions later. Okay. Now it turns out that Keynes is almost half right, and that is that if there's reduction in consumption, people aren't going into Walmart as much buying goods off the shelf, then there'll be a reduction in the work that the stock boys do. There'll be a reduction in the transport industry in bringing retail goods to Walmart and so on. This is out of Marshall. It's called derived demand. In other words, there'll be a fall in demand for inventories if there's a fall in demand to buy those inventories. That's one is derived from the other. It's derived demand. But Keynes thought that was the whole story. There'd be derived demand all the way through the economy. There'd be a reduction in the demand for everything, including investment goods of all sorts. Okay, and what he's overlooking here is that there's an interest rate effect as well. If you look downstairs, you've got a lower interest rate, and that means that credit's cheap. You can finance long-term investment more cheaply. Resources are available. They've been freed up at the consumption end. And the long-term investments will come to fruition at a time when people have saved up purchasing power and can buy this stuff. I mean, that's what it's all about. You're saving now in order to buy more stuff in the future, and the Kirchnerian entrepreneurs are at work to figure out what to produce that you're most willing to buy. So the interest rate effect factors in too, and that's what Keynes left out, okay? But to keep track of that, to keep track of the interest rate effect in comparison with the derived demand effect, that's where you need the structure of production, okay? So I think that's what comes next. I hope it is, the structure of production. So this is capital-based macro. This is the heart of capital-based macro. Hayek envisioned a temporal sequence of stages of production. I array them from left to right, which seems like the American thing to do. Hayek arrayed them from top to bottom. I'm not even sure that's a British thing to do. Maybe it was an Austrian thing to do. But and I'm going to use 5 stages of production, arrayed from left to right. There they are, okay? Now, the idea is that look at the legs of the triangle. The bottom leg shows the stages of production. And the purpose of this diagram is to bring the time element into play as an endogenous variable, okay? We've got time in the picture with those stages of production. The vertical leg is consumption. I'm not saying it's not an axis. It's not a vertical axis. I'm not measuring consumption at each stage. In fact, at each stage, it's the output of that stage which serves as input to the next stage. But you get to the final stage, and the output there is consumption. Okay, so that's the way he set it up. Now, I think the title of my talk ends with "and its relevance today," the Austrian theory and its relevance today. We have to modify this. I'm not going to modify it on this show, but except to tell you what the modification needs to be. That what was totally overblown in this last boom and bust, of course, was the housing industry, the housing stock. And housing is not a point output, okay? It's an output that lasts for the duration of the house. It's a durable asset. It's actually categorized as investment in the national income accounts. And so you have to take into account the economics of holding the mortgage on a house to see the dynamics of this latest boom. But for Hayek, it was a sequence of inputs and a point output. That's the simplest way to get the time element in play, and it's all you need to go up against Keynes. Okay? So let's see how this works. There's an early stage of production. It shows, looks like product development. Look, this guy looks determined, also looks patient. It's going to be a while before he has anything to sell, but hey, he's financing the operations with cheap credit, okay? And so long-term means you can afford to carry the work at low interest until you can eventually sell. At the other end, retail management, looks like this guy pretty much got it knocked, stocked up, ready for customers. He needs some customers. Maybe this is one right here. I think there's one customer anyhow, okay? So that just gets you in the mood to show you what early stage and late stage look like. Okay. Now, this is just pedagogical convenience. I'm showing 5 stages. I could have shown 15 or 17 or whatever. I need to show more than 3 so I can show sort of differential movements in those stages. And the number of stages can change, and probably will change with the change in the rate of interest. The stages They really have two meanings. If this conference was long enough for field trips, we could go out and visit each of these stages. We could see mining operations, and we could see manufacturing and transporting and retail, stocking of inventories, and so this stuff's all going on at the same time. But at the same time, it's a sequence of events that the iron ore being extracted today or the products being developed today won't show up until sometime later as consumable output. Okay, so watch the resources, such goods in process, move through the stages. Here we go. Okay, so in other words, there really is a temporal sequence there moving through these different stages of production. So together, this sequence then of stages in the triangle, it's a summary description of the economy's intertemporal structure of capital, and it can change both in size and in shape. Okay, and let's show the size first. So if you have a growing economy, let's bring the PPF back into play and let the economy grow again. Watch the PPF and structure expand together. And here we're just increasing the size of the triangle. So all of the stages are increasing as we expand outward. There's been no change in preferences. Okay, it goes like that. But when people choose to save, they send two seemingly conflicting signals, that they're seemingly conflicting only in mainstream macro. In Austrian theory, they're coordinating. Okay, let's see how it works. The decrease in consumption dampens the demand for investment goods that are in close proximity with consumption. That would be retail inventories, for instance. But at the same time, the reduced interest rate, which means lower borrowing costs, increases the demand for investment in the early stages. Okay. Now, if you're a Keynesian, in fact, let's see if we don't say something like this right here. Yeah, if you're a Keynesian and you write C plus I plus G, I is investment, which way is it going to change? Well, is it derived demand that dominates, or is it interest rate that dominates? Which way does I go? And of course, Keynes concluded pretty quickly it's derived demand that dominates, and so the investment goes south. But if you have a structured production, it goes both ways. In other words, you get reduced investment in the late stages, increased investment in the early stages, and that's what changes the structure to accommodate future demand to correspond with the increased saving. All right? So you get the differential changes. It was in this particular context that Hayek made the remark that Keynes's aggregates cover up the most important mechanisms of change. In other words, by lumping I investment together in a single magnitude, he couldn't see the market forces at work. Okay? And again, for emphasis, I just point out these two effects: derived demand effect, lowering the late stages, time discount effect, raising the early stages. Now it says, watch the structure of production respond to an increase in saving, which of course is a decrease in interest. You know what's going to happen. The resources are going to shift out of late stage and into early stage. Let's pull the trigger and watch it. There it goes, okay? So you get a longer triangle, a bigger time dimension, and initially a shorter consumption dimension. You're reducing consumption in order to gear up for more consumption in the future. Okay? Now again, let's put this together with the PPF and realize that an increase in saving will affect both the magnitude of investment and the distribution of investment in that temporal structure of production. Watch the economy respond to an increase in saving here. And again, you can watch both at once. Move along the PPF, and at the same time shift resources towards the early end. Right? And so look at the Hayekian triangle. See, we're showing a differential movement. Okay, that's the key, and that's what's not possible in mainstream macro. You don't get that twist in there. You get either goes up or down or stays the same collectively. Okay. Now, let's watch the economy grow more rapidly, and so I do this for a purpose you'll see here in a minute. Okay. Now, what I like to do is plot consumption against time. In other words, what does the consumption look like over time? The economy was growing some to start with, then there was some saving, and then it grew faster. Okay? So if we bring in a chart here where we can show that, we can show it both upstairs and downstairs. Let's look at upstairs first. I'll do this twice because you'll want to look at both graphs. In both graphs, you'll see consumption first falling, like that, then increasing. See there? First falling, then increasing. If you look down here, you'll see the same thing. The consumption falls and then increases at a faster rate. All right? And eventually, increasing beyond, get this thing going there. Increasing beyond where it would be had you not saved in the first place. All right? This is what allows you to see there's an intertemporal trade-off. There's a market signal that says people want to make that intertemporal trade-off differently. They want to forego consumption now in order to be able to consume more in the future. What they're foregoing is the consumption in that part of the diagram, and what they're gaining is consumption at a later time. Okay, again, it's just showing you that's how saving and investment works. Okay. Now, looking very quickly here at stage-specific labor markets, and just I'm going to make the point. I'm going to take my pictures earlier. We had the product development and maintaining retail inventories, and just represent those as supply and demand for labor in those activities. So you have early stage labor and late stage labor, and the view is, or the point is, that those markets respond differentially with a change in the interest rate. In fact, it's response in those markets that cause the resources to be transferred from the late stage to the early stage. All right? Let's look. So in the early stages, I'm skipping ahead here. In the early stages, you'll get an increase in the demand for labor in response to more saving and low interest. And in the late stage, you'll get a decrease in the demand for labor at the same time. And you can watch that. So you get a decrease here and an increase here. In fact, I can square this with Hayek very easily, because he says in Prices and Production that while that restructuring is taking place, there will be what he calls a labor or a wage rate gradient. In other words, wages will be higher here than in the late stages. And so you can actually see that wage rate gradient as the upward slope as we go from right to left to that connector between the two wage rates in the separate markets. Okay. Now, just for a little stock taking here, we have loanable funds market, production possibilities frontier, structure of production, and stage-specific labor markets. And so we can use this whole framework then to watch the economy respond to an increase in saving. You got a lot of watching here. You got to watch everything move at once, okay? But let's pull, and you know exactly what's going to happen. Let's pull the trigger. Okay? That is the market at work for you and for me, as seen by Hayek and as bolstered by Kirshner and Horowitz and others, okay? Now, that answers the problem of how it would work right in the first place. Once we learn how it would work right in the first place, it becomes very easy to see what happens when things go wrong. as in an interest rate distorted by the central bank. All right? So I think that's what we move on to now. I put this slide up just because Steve Hanke looks much more stern than I do, and so you tend to believe him. But he told me he drew this out of time and money, so I would agree with it if only for that reason. But look what Steve says in Forbes. He says, with interest rates artificially low, consumers reduce saving in favor of consumption, and entrepreneurs increase the rate of investment spending, and then you have an imbalance between saving and investment. You have an economy on an unsustainable growth path. This, in a nutshell, is the lesson the Austrian critique of central banking developed in the 1920s and 30s. Well, amen. I mean, he's got it in a nutshell there. I'll put in another, let's see if I did. No, I skipped. No, here it is. Hayek again. And here's Hayek reaffirming as late as 1978 that he still believes this stuff. People want to say, well, Hayek, he recanted, he threw out his own business cycle theory. Not true. As late as 78, I won't read the whole thing, but essentially he's saying he thinks it's still true. And he said this at the same time that he was writing, same period, that he was writing the foreword to Jerry O'Driscoll's book on economics as a coordination problem, and even lamenting that he had given up on business cycle theory and moved on to other matters. Okay. So increase in the money supply, increases money supply enter the economy through credit markets. The central bank literally lends money into existence. When you take a money and banking course, you learn all the ways that the Fed increases the money supply, and you're tested on it. You know, well, they can lower the discount rate, or they can target a lower Fed funds rate, or they can change the reserve requirements. You better get them all three and get them right, and so on, you know, to get credit. But what's important is that they're all three ways of lending money into existence. All three ways of depressing interest rates below where the market would have it. Okay? And here you want to see just a very essentially different kind of process, because we're not talking about nameless entrepreneurs out there. Okay, we're talking about particular individuals who affect, oh, there he is.
Nameless.
Particular individuals who affect credit conditions, okay? So watch the opposing movements of saving and investment. So now what looks for all the world like an outward shift of saving is actually just a padding of the supply of saving with new money created for the purpose, okay? And so let's watch that. There it goes, okay? And so importantly, this line is not dotted like it was before. It's not dotted because it still represents saving. People are saving less, okay? In fact, if you look here, what you see is that, well, let's do it this way. Investors are investing more. They're increasing in investment in response to the decrease in interest, while savers are saving less, okay? That's the wedge you drive between saving and investment. How can these people borrow funds when these people aren't saving them? Well, of course, the difference is precisely the shift. That's precisely what's made up by the central bank, printing money, creating money, and lending it to investors. They don't create saving, they create money. They don't create investable resources, they create money, okay? And that's what causes the trouble, okay? Now, let's look at it in terms of the PPF. Because what happens here, all we have to do is trace up. You see that if investors had their way, they're just pulling the economy along the PPF in the direction of more investment. But consumers are saving less, which is to say they're spending more on consumption. They're trying to pull the economy the other way. Okay? So you get two disequilibriums there. In other words, you got a tug of war here between consumers and investors. Okay, so the wedge here between saving and investment translates into a tug of war between consumers and investors, And then noting the axis, look, consumption is pushing upwards, investment is pushing rightwards, and we just use a little vector analysis and see that the resultant is pushing the economy beyond its sustainable PPF, okay, into an unsustainable region. In other words, it's temporarily producing more than it can sustain and moving towards some, what I call it, a virtual equilibrium. You know, it looks like you might get there, but you won't because it's beyond the PPF, okay? Okay, let's look at the structure of production. And here I'm going to draw on Mises and Strigl. This is where Strigl comes into play. And it turns out two things happen to this triangle. There's some response to both increased consumption and lower interest rate. In other words, the low interest rate causes early stage processes to be initiated. They can't be finished because resources aren't being freed up to finish them. In fact, resources are being consumed. And so that's the other side of the picture. Increased consumer demand is drawing some resources towards the late stages. The triangle is being pulled at both ends against the middle. That's what Richard Strigl says in his book. Even Mises uses the phrase, malinvestment and overconsumption. All right, so you have a discoordinated capital structure. You have some overinvestment, in other words, more investment than is consistent with preferences, and that investment is maldistributed. Malinvestment is what they mean in the early stages. You have overconsumption. There's some overconsumption. We'll call it the same thing in the triangle. We could call it malconsumption, but that sounds like malnourished or something, not enough. So call it still overconsumption. And this is a phrase repeatedly used by Mises, malinvestment and overconsumption. Okay? And now see, we've pretty much got the outlines of the business cycle theory, just in short order by showing this essential corollary. So you have a tug of war that pits consumers against investors, pushes the economy beyond the PPF, and the low interest rate favors investment, and increasingly binding resource constraints keep the economy from reaching the extra PPF point beyond the PPF. John Cochrane at Metropolitan State referred to this as dueling triangles, so I kind of like that designation. Yeah, dueling triangles. And eventually this boom ends in a bust. This is an unsustainable boom because it's based on an interest rate that's essentially telling a lie. Okay. Now, so you get the wedge, you get the tug of war, you get the dueling triangles. And so now we're in a position, I'll put this slide up. It almost sounds like a management class, which puts me to shame. Management are talking about the 3 Ps and the 5 Rs and the 6 Zs or whatever, you know. Put you to sleep, but hey, I can't resist. I got 3 Ps, okay? So padding the supply of loanable funds with new money drives a wedge between saving and investment. Papering over the difference between saving and investment gives play to the tug of war between consumers and investors, and pitting early stages against late stages distorts the Hayekian triangle in both directions, the temporal discoordination eventually turning boom into bust. Okay, that's the story. I'm clicking here. We'll see if we can get too far. So it says, watch the economy respond to a credit expansion. This is sort of the finale. You can see what's going on. It takes the Americans to recognize who that guy. Anybody know?
Joe the Plumber?
That's Joe the Plumber, yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Good question.
Quickly follow up. You showed how the bust with that triangle would look like. You didn't go into what a boom would look like. You didn't go into what the triangle looks like in a bust. Does it react the other way? Does it have more of a, instead of having this kind of curve?
Well, no, good question. So how does it react, how does the triangle itself react during the bust? And you have to give two answers. One is that if the market is left alone, then what you expect to see is that entrepreneurs straighten it out and go back to where it was, okay? And if it reacts differently than that, and by the way, that could take some time. In fact, it will take some time, during which there's bound to be considerable unemployment and considerable waste of capital that has to be discarded, or things have to be liquidated. You know, it would be a painful thing for the economy to go through, but that's the essence of the beast, to have an unsustainable boom like that. One point that needs to be made is that if you remember your macro from college, you made a very, very sharp distinction between so-called structural employment, or structural unemployment, which is what you're not talking about, and cyclical unemployment, which you are talking about. Okay, in the Austrian view, this cyclical, the essential cyclical unemployment is in fact structural. In other words, there's too much employment in the earliest stages, in the very late stages, and not enough in the middle, and this has to get sorted out, and that takes a while to sort out. All right, now if you get stimulus packages and more finagling with the interest rate and so on, at best it delays the recovery, and more likely it makes it worse. All right, and so it even further distorts in different directions the structure of production. So I think that's got to be the answer. Oh, and one more thing I'll say here: what the economy looks like during the bust depends pretty critically on just what form the boom took. For instance, with the Hayekian triangle that assumes a point output, consumption is just a point, it's not an extended period of time, would give you one set of ideas that would suggest that people trying to produce things would find in the middling stages that there aren't enough resources left to finish them, and factors would be bid up, and some of those production processes would become unprofitable, and they'd be abandoned and liquidated, and that's what it would look like. But with a housing bubble, where you have the output of a huge housing stock that's going to last 100 years or whatever, but you've got people trying to pay the mortgage on it for 30 years, then what happens, of course, is that people find they can't pay the mortgage. And then that's what brings it to an end, and you get the foreclosures and all that in the housing market. I'll make one related point here before I go on to the next question, is that sometimes the Austrian theory is criticized on the grounds that, oh, you people think all booms and busts are alike, and yet we see each episode is different than the one before. And it turns out that in most instances, all the important instances that I can think of, artificial booms tend to ride piggyback on top of genuine booms. And so the nature of a particular boom-bust episode reflects whatever else was going on at the time that the artificial boom rode piggyback on it. Okay, and to give you a couple of examples, in the 1920s, it was all sorts of innovations in automobile production, in chemicals, in home appliances, and all of the changes in demand due to electrification, and all that kind of stuff was going on. Well, those things were just overdone, just made stronger by the cheap credit during the 20s. And so that boom took on a particular flavor, and though ended in a bust, as the Austrians would always predict. In the dot-com boom, of course, it was a totally different set of things that were going on. The dot-com companies seem like they're not long-term, they seem kind of short-term. But if you look at the financing of them, they're pretty long-term because so many of the dot-com enterprises spent a number of years losing money while they tried to build market. I think that was the phrase. Pardon?
Amazon.
Yeah, Amazon. They're trying to build market and taking losses while they're trying to build market, which you can do if the interest rate is low, okay? And so it had a long-term planning horizon and was taking losses while it built market, and that made it more of a long-term enterprise than a short-term, which gave you that boom and bust. And then the most recent one, of course, was housing, and you don't have to look far to see why housing was the thing that the artificial boom rode piggyback on. It was because of the reinvestment, Community Reinvestment Act, and the Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and Barney Frank, that were allowing for the housing market to get totally out of hand, and then that got accentuated by Federal Reserve policy. I think the bubble in housing would not have been nearly as severe and would have been pretty much limited to housing had it not been bolstered by Federal Reserve policy. It was Federal Reserve policy that made it economy-wide and even globally wide. Okay, yes?
Do you feel it's possible to recognize a bubble as it is growing or happening? And if yes, should the bubble be popped?
The bubble should not be helped along. You can say that at least. There could have been a point, had the Federal Reserve not been pumping so much credit into credit markets, then the way to fix housing would be to deal with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, okay, and not popping it with Federal Reserve policy. But once the Federal Reserve was in cahoots with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, it was called the Greenspan put, where it was where Greenspan had given any indication that he wasn't going to let these assets fall in price, and that encouraged the market to keep the boom going. Then he was in a position, then the Fed was in a position of having a tiger by the tail. So it was damned if it did and damned if it didn't. There was a lot of discussion at the Fed about whether to pop the bubble or try to pop it, and a lot of conflicting stories. One is they tried to pop it and couldn't. One, they thought it was not right for them to pop it. They thought it would pop by itself anyhow, and that there wouldn't be much fallout. Okay. So a lot of controversy there, but ultimately, I think, my judgment is that they knew it was going to pop, and they didn't want to be the fall guy. The Fed didn't want to be held responsible for having popped it. But I think even the people at the Fed were amazed at how much, at the aftermath of the pop bubble. Yes, back there.
Do you think the financial crisis might be like that actually unlocked the market for 2001 instead of stopping?
No, you have to repeat the question. I just didn't quite hear.
Okay, sorry. I was wondering, do you think we could have prevented this last financial crisis if the Fed had actually left the market for itself in 2001 or 2002?
Yeah, the question, if the Fed had let the market correct itself after the dot-com boom, yes, I think that would have been a huge help anyhow. Now, you still had the Community Reinvestment Act in play, and you still had the government-sponsored enterprises distorting housing prices, but it certainly would have been less severe. And had the Fed not held interest rates at 1%, the Fed funds rate at 1% per year, which amounted to a negative real rate, I think that the crisis could have been much more readily confined to the housing market and not affected the economy generally like it did. Yeah. Yes.
Can you reconcile using Hayek triangles with re-switching and looping?
Yeah. The question is, how do you reconcile the Hayekian triangle with the Cambridge capital controversy, which involves capital re-switching and technique reversing. I got that backwards, isn't it? Technique reswitching and capital reversing. Let me just take a poll there. How many have heard of the Cambridge capital theory and know about technique reswitching and capital reversing? Good, okay, good. One guy, okay. Let me just give you a standing on one foot explanation. Capital theorists in Cambridge, this is England, Cambridge, England, argued that Bohm-Bawerk didn't quite have it right. His math was too simple, and if you allow for inputs and outputs to be expressed by polynomials instead of rectangles or linear inputs, you find that the production process could lengthen or shorten with the change in the interest rate. If the interest rate falls, maybe it'll shorten, maybe it'll lengthen, you don't know. You have to look at the math and see how it turns out. And the way the math turns out is that there are only trivial exceptions, or very small exceptions to the proposition that a low interest rate encourages long-term investment. You can come up with counterexamples. But even Cambridge capital theorists like Joan Robinson, she wrote an article called "The Unimportance of Reswitching." Okay, that just the magnitude doesn't amount to anything. If you read Hayek's Pure Theory of Capital, he acknowledges that yes, you can have funny profiles that seem to run counter to the general proposition that low interest rate encourages long-term production. Okay, but those are very trivial. I've published articles on this. I can give you a link to one. But one thing I observed is that to get numbers that are where the reswitching is visible to the naked eye, you have to have the interest rate changing from 100% to 50% or something like that, and which itself suggests how minor that distinction is. And there are actually more fundamental criticisms that are based on how the Cambridge capital theorists measure roundaboutness. And the Austrians don't really measure it. They don't need to measure it. It's enough to show you the pictures. I mean, you saw the picture of the research and development chemist, and you saw the picture of the retail clerk. Okay, that's what we're talking about, however you describe that mathematically. So I think economically, that just doesn't work. There are economists, post-Keynesians are the main ones, who throw up that Cambridge capital controversy as a killer of Austrian business cycle theory. Okay, they see that as basis for just dismissing Austrian business cycle theory. But I think with very little justification. Yes?
Looking at those graphs, it seems like that an increase in the amount of money will cause malinvestment and overconsumption in the future. So isn't it possible to find an increase in the amount of money that boosts consumption now, but still keeps the economy on a sustainable growth path?
To have an increase in money supply, do what?
That still keeps the economy on a sustainable growth path.
Oh, yeah, well, the question is about would any increase in the money supply cause this malinvestment? And yeah, well, of course, the less of an increase, the less malinvestment it would cause. But maybe the point I need to make is that in Hayek's view, and Mises for that matter, and I think they're right on this point, and Larry White argues similarly, if the money supply is increased just enough to keep the price level constant, okay, just you write MV equal PQ like Steve Horowitz did, and if M goes up just enough to match the increase in output, Q, that keeps the price level constant, will that cause business cycle? Hayek would say yes. In fact, the application is precisely the 1920s. That during the 1920s, the overall price level didn't rise much at all, except at the very end, and then it just increased a little bit. But the Fed was pumping money in, And the key is that even if that's why it's pumping it in, to keep the price level from falling, it still depresses interest rates. Okay, you pump it in, you depress interest rates. And you've got an interest rate that doesn't reflect people's willingness to save. And that causes the dislocation. Hayek was at New York University on a postdoc in the late 20s. And had he finished his dissertation there, he didn't. But the whole dissertation centered on what he called artificial price level stabilization. It is artificial price level stabilization, which means increasing the money supply just to keep the price level from changing. Is that consistent with sustainable growth? And his answer was no, it's not. And he even talked about the coming bust, the coming downturn, just on the grounds that the money was being pumped through credit markets and was depressing interest rates. You call that one right?
Is
Yes.
it possible to access his unwritten dissertation?
No, the only thing I know about it is in the little volume called Hayek on Hayek, 1984, which is smattering of portions of interviews done at UCLA. Larry knows more about that. Were you going to say something about
I
it?
was going to say something about the previous one.
Oh, okay. Well, let me get you in a minute. At UCLA in the late 70s, Hayek did a number of interviews at UCLA, and people were asking him about that period, and he mentions his dissertation topic. So all I know about it was his topic, and that he didn't finish it.
Or his papers somewhere?
Hoover Institution. But now whether that's there, I doubt if it is, otherwise it would have been published. Larry?
Well, on that question, Hayek's dissertation on imputation, it's sort of distilled, the essence of it is in an article he wrote, published on imputation in 1926. I edited the Pure Theory of Capital, and now I'm editing a volume which Bruce here. Bruce reminded me of my debt to him when I first met him at lunch today, which will include this essay on imputation. And in the archive, part of it survives. Hayek, in one of these interviews, said he hoped it had been lost because he was not so proud of it anymore. He had rethought his position on imputation. On the previous question, I took the previous question to be, can there be an increase in the money supply that doesn't disequilibrate the loanable funds market? And the answer is yes. If people want to save more, and the way they save more is to consume less and to acquire more bank liabilities, and those bank liabilities are counted as part of the money supply, and that's an increase in the measured money supply that is responding to the demand to save, then there's no distortion of the interest rate caused by that increase in the money supply. It's endogenous. It's not being instigated regardless of people's savings preferences by the central bank. The second example would be in an international gold standard, a country that's growing will be importing gold from the rest of the world, growing faster than the rest of the world. That's an endogenous increase in the money supply that's equilibrating and not disequilibrating.
Okay, so your point is if it's demand-led, demand-driven, if there's an increase in demand to hold funds, then accommodating that increase would not depress the interest rate. Yeah, I'll take that. I got that from you, Larry.
I wanted to remind you.
Oh, okay. And I guess the further point, I don't want to give Larry's lecture, but the Federal Reserve would be just monumentally incapable of doing that. In other words, it doesn't have a timely signal about what the demand for cash holdings are. That would be the same thing as trying to figure out what changes in the velocity of money might be. It doesn't know. That can only be calculated much later. But other kinds of monetary institutions will automatically take that into account. Decentralized institutions can take that into account without knowing exactly what the change is. Okay. So that's a case against central banking is what it is. Anybody else? Yes.
Will there still be business cycles after we got rid of the central banking? And can you please just comment on the tulip mania, what the link is between the tulip mania and Austrian business activity.
Oh, okay. I don't know if I can have anything to contribute about tulipomania, but will there still be business cycles if we have a decentralized system? I would say no, or if they were, they'd be extremely minor. In other words, it takes that centrality to give the boom any duration. And that if you have a decentralized competitive system, an expanding bank, a single expanding bank would do itself in and wouldn't do the economy in. And it would be virtually impossible for there to be coordination among the banks to orchestrate an expansion. So, yeah, I think if you do away with the central bank, you're pretty much done away with certainly business cycles as we know them.
So it will be only full reserve banking, or would be no business cycles?
Pardon?
If there would only be full reserve banking, there would not be business cycles anymore.
If there were competitive banking, I would say. If there competitive banking, yeah. But yes.
Do you think it's possible to reform central banking? If so, what should be done?
Yeah, I can't imagine a smooth transition away from central banking and towards decentral banking. That might just reflect the fact that I don't claim to be a macro strategist. Okay, I don't know how you get from here to there, but I think that if we ever got something like decentralized banking, it would have to be something that developed out of the ashes after we just had a profound collapse of some kind. I don't see, but that's the way big changes in institutional arrangements take place sometimes. But I don't see a gradual transition from central to decentral. Let me give him a follow-up and I'll come back. Yes.
Now, also, do you think it's possible to improve monetary policy, for instance, by scrapping inflation targeting and trying to some way find out what the actual natural rate is?
Oh, I don't think you can find out what the natural rate is as long as you have a central bank. I think this is a big player argument. If you've got the central bank in play, it camouflages that natural rate. You don't know what it is. It's like the old Soviet economy trying to figure out what the natural price of shoes is. There's no way to figure it out if it's the sole producer of shoes. There's no way to figure out what the natural rate is. The inflation targeting presupposes a particular natural rate, namely 2%. So that doesn't help. Okay, that builds in a particular natural rate, which may be too high in some cases or too low in others. Yeah.
I wonder if we could possibly push for just allowing for, either passing a law by Congress, let's say, to allow 100% reserve free market banks to just exist, just to allow them. They have to work out the contractual details, just to allow that. And then maybe as a precursor to that, maybe trying to go to a smaller country, maybe Guatemala or someplace like that, try to get something passed in a smaller country, which would be kind of like a case study approach where people could see how that does. And then if it's successful, then maybe we would be able to get a law like that passed in America, which is just allow competition in the banking system between, where nobody would have to be worrying about somebody doing finagling, just kind of a different way to have their money in a 100% reserve type system.
Okay, I don't know if there's a legal obstacle to 100% reserve banking now. Larry, can a bank hold 100% reserves if it wants to? I think it could do it right now if it wanted to. And it would if that would attract a lot of depositors.
But they would be still working with a money supply that would be based by other people. So they wouldn't be able to give the
So you
best
want them to have a
rates.
different kind of money or
Yeah,
something?
you'd have to be able to have a separate gold system, and then people could choose to use the gold or the Federal Reserve notes. And you just have it on the same, credit
Yeah.
card machines like Discover or
Yeah.
American Express. Just have the gold card, and you'd be trading in gold with those people that wanted to trade on the gold market with that 100%
Yeah.
reserve.
Again, I think that's legal now, isn't it, Larry? I mean,
Well, there was a 100% gold transfer system online called eGold. And they were busted by the feds for violating money transfer laws, money laundering laws. As though they were competition from the feds.
okay.
Yeah, the Treasury Department shut them down.
Well, who was the guy that was making his rounds in Athens and Auburn peddling gold money?
Bernard von Nothaus.
Von Nuthouse.
Unfortunate name. Very unfortunate name.
Was that Nothouse or Nothouse? Is he still in business?
He was busted for violating the laws against making coins.
Oh, but that was a different bust than the first one. Huh? Okay. So evidently the Fed doesn't like those people, but it seems like if they just leave them alone, it would work. It would work out. Okay. Any other questions?